Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your host, Greg Carr, and this is our weekly hour devoted to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to African people and others working and fighting to build a better society. You might have noticed that normally I would have on a dashiki, a little bit formal dress, but my mama's from Russell County, Alabama, just outside Phoenix City. And I've always had a special place in my heart for Tuskegee University, where as a little girl in the 1940s, she ran track on some of those fields at Tuskegee. Today, we are deeply, deeply honored to have a brother who has written about that institution, its place in the imaginary of African people in the United States and beyond, its place in the history of the last century and a quarter, almost century and a half, and in many ways, its meaning and its centrality to questions of education and social change. That man is no other than Dr. Brian P. Jones. Brian Jones is the inaugural director of the Center for Educators and Schools at the New York Public Library. Before that, he was a scholar in residence and associate director for education at the Schomburg Center, the legendary Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He comes out of education at every level. He spent almost a decade as a public school teacher in the city, working in elementary school primarily, and carried that momentum into a run for public office while he was in graduate school. No small feat. The Green Party candidate for lieutenant governor of the state of New York. And we're going to have him back to discuss this whole range of debate around charter schools and public schools. But all of that passion, all of that energy has been emptied into his work, whether it be in anthologies like Black Lives Matter at School, his work with the Howard Zinn Project, his work with any number of public education and social change transformation formations, and his work in particular today that he poured into the Tuskegee Student Uprising, a history. Dr. Brian Jones. Brian, it's good to have you here, brother.
Wow. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's really an honor to be on this show. I'm a huge fan of this show. And so I'm thrilled to be in this hot seat.
Oh, no, the seat is definitely going to be hot. All those who oppose our common humanity. But where we are right now is dead cool, brother. Europe, I was down in Vodun. I do have on a hot color in red, but it's the Golden Eagle. So I hope you'll forgive me, man. Let's just jump right into it. I couldn't put this book down. First of all, thank you for sending it to me. And I appreciate the fact that you told us before we started taping, and I hope you'll relate to everyone watching how you came to do that. And you know, particularly as somebody who's a grandson of Alabama, and I hope one day to go down there and perhaps even set up shop and work for a while. Reading line for line, this work and what Tuskegee meant and means, I mean, it's just nothing short of transformative. Could you give us a sense, particularly since as I read through and you said your father went to Tuskegee, I think it was 57 to 61 or 2.
That's right, yeah.
How did you come to write this book, man?
Well, thank you for that question. The story doesn't start with my father, but it loops back to him because it was really when I was working in Harlem as an elementary school teacher in the early part of this century, in the first decade and a half of this century. And I was experiencing Harlem as the epicenter, it felt like, of a movement to privatize public education. And so it felt like the rug was being pulled out from under us. Teachers like me and my colleagues, many of whom teaching in Harlem were Black, seemed to be positioned as the problem, as enemies of learning and success in schools. And I was curious about the way in which very, very wealthy people seem to focus on, at least rhetorically, the fate of Black students. And I thought that's really what is going on here. I mean, something wild is going on here. And because I've always been interested in Black history and, you know, Black history has been a touchstone for me, I never pursued deeply, though, Black education history. And so I started reading and trying to understand it better to see how we got to where I was. What was the story building up to that? And it's that story that led me to Tuskegee. as the foundation stone of a hope that similar kind of people, elites, white people, after the overthrow of radical Reconstruction, it seemed like they had high hopes that they could create a model of education for Black people in the South as a means of social control. And I think what the Tuskegee student uprising shows, or the story that I ended up finding, is that you can design whatever you want for people, but once people gather in a place, they bring their own ideas to it. And education is a thing that's hard to contain, actually, because once you can read anything. Once you can write anything. Yeah. So that's when, once I started fixating on Tuskegee and Booker T. Washington, that's when I went to my dad, who went there. And, he is the type who loves this sort of thing, loves to dig into the history in the past and learn more. And he's really a curious person. So he suggested that we drive there together. Neither of us had done any archival research before. This was, I was trying to get a PhD in education. I wasn't thinking of myself as a historian.
I was going to say, I mean, if memory serves me correctly, although you were at CUNY, I'm assuming Manny Marable was not yet taking the turn. He was still kind of around, because you talk about him being at Tuskegee, and then, obviously, but this sounds like as much of a rite of passage. As I was reading it, I could imagine being in that car. I wish I could have taken a trip like that with my pop, man. What was that like?
I mean, it was amazing. It was amazing. And, of course, I have the recorder going. So my first interview is this long car ride interview with him.
This is the one you don't say in the car, but I did see that you interviewed. That's the car interview.
Yeah, it's the car interview. It's a long interview. And it's like, suddenly, I'd never heard these stories before. Suddenly I'm hearing, we'd never gone deep about Tuskegee. So suddenly I'm hearing all this stuff about what it was like. And, of course, when you do research, if you're doing it right, it's full of surprises. Like you're not going to find what you expect to find. So, lots of things. The first thing you learn is how much you don't know. And I started realizing there was this whole big story about the faculty. I knew nothing about all this activism that the faculty had done. But the reason we were going together really was that I had seen in the literature these mentions, and I didn't see a book anywhere that anybody had written, but I had seen these mentions that students had protested in the earliest years of the school, in 1896 and 1905. And I thought, oh my God, that's while Booker T. Washington was there. And, sometimes I see, as I'm trying to understand the relationship between people like Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, I see people dismissing Du Bois's criticisms. And, understandably, because Booker T. Washington was born in slavery, that's a different thing than being born in Massachusetts,
No
Du Bois went to Harvard.
That's right.
It's just a different, and so that's understandable. But the students are different, though. The students were not from Massachusetts. The students in 1896 are from Alabama and Louisiana. Like they're part of that movement out of slavery with Booker T. Washington. So I thought, oh, this shows the campus as a contested space from the beginning. It's not just the genius of the founder. It's that actually other people showed up to realize their dreams.
That's right.
And that those dreams were part of this long Black freedom movement that so often has been focused on learning, on literacy and learning for liberation.
Go ahead. I love the way that you, throughout the book, pay homage to the generations of intellectual workers who have preceded us. I mean, I know every fall in my Education in Black America class, I teach James Anderson's book, The Education of Blacks in the South, and you bring that to the table. You put it right up front. And like you said, these students show up. I remember there was one, remember that story when they were at Hampton and the brother writes home and said, I came here to learn math and science. They got me painting fence posts and out here digging in the field. I mean, as you say, the story of Tuskegee in the 60s is preceded by all these Black college rebellions that are student led. It was really fascinating to see. And you even brought up an old chestnut, although I did not know he did this racist turn later in life. Ray Walter's book, The New Negro on Campus. Could you talk a little bit about that genealogy? And we'll probably pick this up in the next block, but this genealogy of student movements that began, as you say, right, almost coterminous with the beginning of these institutions.
Yeah, and I hope historically Black colleges are starting to, if they don't already, recognize that although it can be awkward to embrace these critics, these are students who are raising criticisms of the school, but in the long view, look at them as this vanguard that was ever showing higher education its future. They were always pushing forward, and their demands that were intolerable in pick the year, flash forward a decade, and that was policy. Wow. They were at the forefront of democratizing the higher education, of expanding the curriculum. They were pushing and pushing and pushing. And sometimes it's more about their individual career aspirations, and sometimes it's more about the politics, refusing Jim Crow on campus, and that sort of thing. And